Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Rent Prep for Landlords. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about 11 steps that landlords should take when evaluating new tenants. So you just got me, Eric Worrell, here on the podcast today. Steve, he's not off. He's actually interviewing people. We're getting some more screeners in the office. Thanks again for you guys that are using us for your background checks. We appreciate it. And we're going to be working through an article from Forbes here in a second and sharing tips and insights and kind of some of my perspectives on those as well as we go through it. So let's get to that right after this.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Welcome to the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. And now your hosts, Stephen White and Eric Worrell.
All right, we're going to go with a pretty simple but important podcast today. So I found this article. It was just written on Forbes. And I like it because it's kind of a community real estate council kind of post. So they got 11 different people that chimed in to give their insights on pretty much the tenant screening process. This was posted on September 14th, 2018. And what I wanted to do was go over the 11 tips mentioned in the post and got to give you some insights and some things that we know from being a tenant screening company for 11 years. And maybe you can get a few tips, a few takeaways, and some things that you can think about when you're screening your tenants. So, number one, the first tip that's listed here is have a clear protocol. The first thing you should do is have a system and follow it at all times. Deviation is the devil here. If everyone does it the same on the intake, hopefully results will be satisfactory. If you don't feel you need this, okay, but you do need it. Look for some property management software and try it out. You may learn something your fill in the blank never told you. So, I don't know what the fill in the blank never told you part's about, but I think I know what Michael J. Polk is getting at, and that is systematizing what you do. Good example of that is we go through a decent amount of hiring screeners here at Rent Prep, and one of the things that we have gleaned from the tenant screening process that we've figured out from our clients is doing a Google survey. So you may have heard me talk about this before. This is something that you can add to your protocol, but Google Drive, that you can create a Google form for free. It's very easy to do. And you can ask questions of people and have them fill out those questions and be very basic. Do you have any pets? Do kind of going down some of your standard criteria and add that as a little half step in your tenant screening process. So what that'll do is you can get some feedback and information from all your applicants before you ever talk to anybody on the phone. So you can actually make that survey using something called Logic, push people to either, sorry, you're not a good fit for this rental property, or enter your information to proceed to the next steps. And the great thing about it is you'll get a time-stamped Google sheet that will explain the answers that everybody filled out for your rental property and what they did. So the leads on that sheet are all the people who passed your initial criteria questions before you ever talk to them. So this is one of those standard protocols that you can add into your tenant screening process. And we've actually mimicked this through our employee screening process. So before we have a phone call, before we get to the next step of having a new screener come in and potentially apply or interview for a position, we do the same thing. We have a Google form and we kind of run them through a few questions and see if they can think on their feet. Are you capable of researching and finding answers for our clients based on our knowledge base? Are you resourceful? And from those answers, we've been able to about weed out 50% of the employees that are looking to work at Rent Prep before they ever even make it to the phone call. So you can do the same thing with your tenant screening process. So in the notes of this episode, I will link out to a video that kind of explains that further, but I have some other resources for you that you can check out for that. Or before we go to tip 2, I just want to say thank you to Michael J. Polk of Polk Properties for that tip. So again, this is coming from a Forbes article. They had 11 people on their real estate council just kind of give their insights on pretty much 11 tenant screening tips. Like, what do you do when you're trying to place a new tenant? So the number 2 tip is to take previous landlord references seriously. This one comes from Deborah Rubino of BAT, which is Vesta, New York. And she says that a previous landlord reference is a very important piece of reviewing any potential tenant's application. Here's some of the questions I ask. Can you recommend this tenant without reservation? Has the tenant had any issues with any neighbors? How long have they been your tenant? Were you able to return the tenant's security deposit, or did you need to hold anything back for repairs? I think these are great. I like the way that she mentions that she says that Can you recommend this tenant without reservation? I like the way that's phrased. I think that's a great question that she asked there. One of the things I don't see on here is, did the tenant have any pets or have any guests move in with them? I mean, these are questions you can ask, and you're not going to get in trouble for these questions. They're simple questions. If they don't want to answer them, they don't have to. But sometimes you'll have a tenant that, tries to sneak a pet in or sneak an extra roommate in. Did you have any issues like that? Those are some additional questions you can ask. And I will also link to our video series we have. We recorded a video series with Steve White, our CEO, who, if you've never heard this podcast before, is usually our co-host here. And he goes through exactly how to perform verification calls. So if you're calling the current landlord, the previous landlord, or the employer, he walks through mock phone calls and he has scripts for you available. So I'll link to that in the show notes of this episode. So you can check us out. You can just go to rentprep.com, click on podcast. You can go and check it out there and get all these resources that I'm mentioning. Let's go to tip 3, which is assess pattern of behavior. This comes from Jeremy Brandt at webuyhouses.com. And he says that on the application, ask for at least 3 places they've lived with contact information for the landlord. Ask the tenant, when I call your past landlords, what will they say about you? Then actually call these landlords and hear how the tenant was. This is important because bad tenants don't always have evictions or bad credit that show up on a report, but they do have a pattern of behavior. So that's a great point. And one of the things that we stress here at RentPrep is the tenant background check is not the end all be all. It's just part of the tenant screening equation. It's a full 360 approach. And, I know that sounds cliche to say, but that you have to take the tenant screening and finding the right tenant. So it's doing your due diligence. It's making those phone calls. And I know sometimes people have phonophobia and it's awkward to make those phone calls. If it's really something you don't like doing, you can hire us to do that for you. We have screeners in the office that will make phone calls. But call those previous landlords, see if they're, things like a noise complaint. Those don't usually show up on a background check. But if they have a history of noise complaints from, the neighboring tenants or the neighbors next door, that's the type of stuff that can show up when you call and talk to a previous landlord. So making those phone calls is important. And as Jeremy puts here, assess a pattern of behavior. So let's move on to tip number 4, which is scrutinize their history against written criteria. This is so important. You hear us talk about it all the time, but this comes from Caroline Kay of CKR Property Management. And Caroline says that the criteria for residency should actually be posted and available in the leasing office. So if you got a property management company, you should have it posted in the leasing office. A complete application should be obtained on all persons over the age of 18. A credit report, criminal background, and verification through the registered sex offender database should be obtained so that the complete picture can be evaluated. Employment and rental history should be verified as well. I agree with everything that's written here. It might have just been left out because it was kind of part of just the background check, but I didn't see anything about an eviction search mentioned. That's extremely important too. But I agree with Caroline 100%. So looking at their rental history against a written criteria. Again, I'm going to have resources on all this. We have tenant screening criteria for you that you can use. We have a couple different versions. One that goes really into the weeds. One of our previous podcast guests actually let us borrow, and another one that is a little bit easier, a little bit more generic, but will still get you through. I look at the tenant screening criteria as kind of like think about it as an answer key. Back in the day when you had to do the bubble, scantrons. I don't know if kids still do this. It makes me feel old, but you put your number 2 pencil and you answer it, and then a teacher would just kind of look at them and they'd have their answer key and they'd be able to quickly assess if what you put in was the correct answer or not. That's what your tenant screening criteria is. It's just a little answer key that you can put next to your renter profile. And if you're using tools like the Google form I mentioned earlier, you can compare, you can just go right down the list and maybe add a column or 2 and start marking things off where, nope, this person, had an eviction, this person had this. And if you have some sort of scoring model, it makes it a lot easier on you. Is it going to be more time consuming? 100%. But that's in the beginning. When you're setting your tenant screening criteria up, it's going to take you a little bit more time, But then every time after that, it's going to be easier. And you're also going to have something to point to when somebody says, hey, I feel like you discriminated against me when you denied me that rental. And you can say, no, actually, this is the reason why. And I share this with everybody. A lot of people will even put it, if they have a website, will put it up on their website or even put a link to it in their rental listing. So that's a great tip from Caroline Kane. Thank you for that. So moving right along, we're going to try to buzz through these for you because I'm sure some of these you've heard of, but we want to just kind of give you a little extra details whenever we can. So number 5, hold in-person interviews. So this comes from Eddie Lauren of Impact Housing REIT and Strategic Realty Holdings. So Eddie says that credit score alone is no longer the reliable indicator it once was. Many people can lose their jobs with a perfect credit score, so it really is important to interview potential tenants, look them in the eye, and call on their references. You can tell a lot by the tone of the references. Ask directly if the person is a good tenant who meets their obligations. This is the art of business. So again, it's going back to making those calls, those verification calls. And I know for a fact a lot of landlords don't do it. A lot of property managers don't do it. I've talked to property managers who have 1,000 units in their portfolio and have been doing it for 20 years. And they say, I can count on 2 hands the number of verification calls I've received about former tenants. Now, not every tenant, is going to be going into another rental. Some of them might buy a house, but a lot of them are going to go into another rental. So make those calls. Hold those in-person interviews, like he's saying. Just make sure you're doing it the right step in the tenant screening process, right? You don't need to go immediately from your rental listing and somebody says, I'm interested, and you go, all right, I'm gonna meet you. No, that's where you can have that Google form survey I mentioned earlier, and that's when you have a pre-screening survey or a pre-screening phone call that somebody can talk to you on the phone. And then if they pass that section of your screening process, then you can go into an in-person interview. Some people like to do an interview in a public spot, especially if you're somebody who may feel vulnerable in the situation. You can, meet them at a coffee shop first. Snap a photo of their ID or tell them that you need a copy of their ID before you meet them. That one, it's got a gray area to it because some places will say that you shouldn't be doing that because it could be misconstrued as age discrimination if you're trying to pull what their age was off of their ID. But really just try to figure out something that's an identifier of them that you can have so it kind of make them think twice before, they would try to do something that could harm you. Again, that's, rare instances, but it doesn't hurt to be safe. It's better safe than sorry in these situations. So if you're going to do an in-person interview, you can think about either bringing someone with you, starting the interview off in a public space, or doing an open house and having, other people in the area so that you're not just you and this stranger that you haven't met before. So number 6, have a bulletproof lease agreement. The smartest step, and this comes from Angelo Rumora from List and Sell Realty. He says that the smartest step is to have a bulletproof lease agreement that is constantly tweaked to your changing needs as a landlord or property manager. Another tip, ask a veteran company for a copy of their lease to tweak to your liking and business model. Also, having a good legal counsel that can help you at any given moment is great. So I couldn't agree with this more. Comes up all the time. People in our Facebook group, Rent Prep for Landlords, you'll see it a lot where they say, I'm dealing with this issue and it's very specific. What do I do? And people are saying, what does it say in your lease? So the more thorough your lease is, the more that it can address, the better off you are as a landlord. I agree with this 100%. Have a great lease agreement. Your local landlord associations sometimes are the best places to get them because there might be things specific to your township or your city. A lot of times different states are going to have different rules and regulations as well. But you want it to get very specific. And probably one of the better tips, or at least more interesting tips I've heard, is from a podcast that we did with the reluctant landlord, Elizabeth Colgrove. And she actually had a policy in her lease that the first $100 of any repair are on the tenant and not the landlord. Now, I've never heard of that before, but she said she swears by it. And what it does is it cuts off some of those, annoying, pesky type situations that you're dealing with where a tenant says, the kitchen sink isn't running correctly. The faucet isn't really working too well. And really, it's just that little aerator needs to be cleaned out, right? Well, if it's not going to cost them anything, they have no problem having you come out to fix it or you send a handyman to fix it. But once they realize that they got a little skin in the game, then they're not as likely to just call you for every little nick in the apartment, and they can take a little bit of initiative on their end to make sure that things are being taken care of well. And she said she hasn't had a lot of blowback on that, and she explains it clearly up front that that's part of the reason that she has that in her lease. So I would say definitely check that out. Tip number 7 here comes from Tanya Delahaz from Dwell Summit, Dwell. And Tanya says that you can check their social media because the landlord should always use a third-party background and credit check service. That's somebody like RentPrep. But they should never skimp on checking references. Just like when you apply for a job and HR takes time to Google the potential new hire, we always Google our prospective tenants. You don't have to agree with their lifestyle, but it's a good idea to see what they post publicly. I think that's a great tip. The only thing I'd add to Tanya's comment here is if you are going to check social media, you go on Facebook, do a couple searches. Check by their name, and check by their phone number, and check by their email. Some people will have dual accounts, and they don't have dual accounts because they're trying to, fool you. They probably have it because they're trying to fool mom or dad. What some people will have is they will have one account attached to their email, a different account attached to their phone number, their cell phone number. So do a search on their name, their email, and their phone number, on Facebook, Twitter, wherever you're looking for it. LinkedIn's a great one. If their information's public, you can see, from a quick snapshot, does the information match up with what they put for their employment history? You don't have to, take everything verbatim because sometimes there might be some discrepancies and a reason why. But these are great tools that you have at your disposal just to give a quick search and see if things match up that are on their application. Another one too is that you can check the landlord verification. So if they have a previous landlord, before you call, you can usually do a county search of that property to see who the landlord is. So does the name that they provide match with the name on the application? And again, don't, take this 100% verbatim because sometimes, they might have thought the property manager was the landlord and they put the property manager's name on there. And when you search the county records, which a lot of times is free to do, you'll see the landlord's name. But it is reassuring when you see the landlord's name listed on there and you also see that that's the person who owns that rental property in the county records. I will try and link to that. I know I'm going to have a lot of things to link to from this episode, but we will, I believe we have a video that we can share with you too on that, on how to check that out in case you're not familiar with that. So this next one comes, tip number 8 actually comes from a competitor. So this comes from Saren Steinbarth of Turbo Tenant. And they said to make sure to screen all applicants. When you have co-applicants interested in your property, like a couple of roommates, it can be tempting to only screen one of them. But tenant screening best practices dictate that you should screen all applicants over the age of 18. Each renter has a unique past, credit, and background history and can vary widely between co-applicants. So get a full picture and screen each person applying. Couldn't agree more. It's a great point. You want to make sure that if you have 3 applicants, maybe they're younger 3 guys or something living in your rental property, you want to screen each one. Because if one's got a major red flag, they've got multiple evictions or violent crimes or something like that, one bad apple is going to spoil the bunch, and then you're going to be hitting the reset button soon enough because, you didn't screen all 3 applicants. A lot of people will screen everybody over the age of 18. And even sometimes if you have a long-term renter and a child, maybe starts at 17, once they turn 18 and you renew that renter from year to year, you want to run that background check just to make sure everything's still good. You can run that on the 18-year-old child as well. I know it seems thorough, but you're giving somebody keys to your rental property that you've got tens of thousands of dollars invested into. And I always say, people, if you want to go get a cell phone, a new cell phone plan, Verizon, Sprint, whatever, they're going to run your credit just for a $100 a month cell phone, So if you're handing somebody the keys to your investment future, run a background check. Like don't skimp out on that and make sure you run it on all the applicants of the age of 18 or older. So let's move along to tip number 9 here out of the 11 tips on making sure you find the right tenant. The title of this post, again, is 11 Steps Landlords Should Take When Evaluating New Tenants from Forbes.com. And we are on to tip 9 from Chris Ryan of Beyond Properties Group. And he says, think like a detective. He says a credit check is a must to ensure the tenant has a good record of payments and is therefore likely to pay rent on time. Criminal background checks are also crucial to make sure the tenant has no history of crime, particularly with manufacturing or selling drugs. Properties that have previously been involved in drug manufacturing depreciate in value and can make it hard to rent again. That's a really good point, especially in the Midwest. You've heard us talk about this on the podcast before. Meth can be a really big issue. When you have a meth lab being run out of one of your rental properties, it is a major, major issue. You're going to have to make sure that you get the proper cleanup and everything done on it professionally, which is going to cost you a lot of money. And then I believe they have to even run tests on the walls to make sure there's no meth residue. Because if you have a family move in, especially young children that move into that property, those young children especially are going to be susceptible to getting sick because of those chemicals that are on the walls and all over the apartment and the residue that was left behind. So make sure that you run that background check on the, especially the criminal and anything to do with drugs and manufacturing or selling of drugs. So great point from Chris Ryan at Beyond Properties Group. Now let's move on to tip number 10. This one comes from Linda Liberatore of Secure Pay One, my landlord helper. So she says that you need to review compliance to housing laws. So smart, savvy landlords ensure they review compliance to fair housing laws in combination with state or local regulations. A critical component to screening is maintaining a consistent process for all. Creating written guidelines and scorecards enables stricter guidelines and transparency. Having documentation in the event of a question by an applicant or an audit can save you unnecessary fines. So first of all, backing up to that unnecessary fine she's talking about, if you were found guilty of discrimination, a first-time landlord, right? You've never had any issues before. First-time offender of the laws laid out in the FHA, and you're guilty of discrimination, you can be fined up to nearly $20,000. So it's really important you understand the laws that are around tenant screening, compliance, when it comes to the Fair Housing Act, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, FCRA, understanding what you need to do as a landlord and what you need to know. I'll link again to a resource that we have that goes through all the laws that you need to know. But then also, like Linda mentions, make sure that you're up to date on your state or local regulations. So here where we are in Buffalo, New York, in the suburbs, we have towns that are neighboring towns that have completely different laws on how to handle a tenant applicant or a tenant who is transgender, right? One town has no mention of it in their town laws, and the other town treats it as a protected class. So that's also something that's a newer topic that towns are needing to address as time goes on. But that's one example of how two towns next to each other can have very different rules. Other towns or cities, they may have, a landlord registry where somebody else doesn't have that. So you want to make sure that you're up to date. And again, landlord associations can be very helpful with that because there'll be somebody there who can help you, bring you up to date because they usually have some sort of attorney that's kind of the official attorney of that landlord association. We're going to move on to the 11th tip, the final tip here. This one comes from Noel Christopher, or Noel, from Renter's Warehouse, and he says to use a third-party service. So we rely on a third-party company that not only pulls credit, evictions, and background, but also call the previous landlord. You can do this. I know this is sounding redundant, but you can do this on your own, but relying on a professional third party can cut liability and give you a consistent process. We always meet prospective tenants in person, many times with their current residents. We rely less on the credit score and more on the personal touch and stable job. So I'll address a few things here. He talks about liability. So using a professional third-party company can help cut that for you. One of the ways that's done is one of the things we see that happens a lot are landlords want to make a copy of a background check, or they tell the person to run their own background check and email them a copy, or, run your credit score and email us a copy. Well, a lot of these things are not done in a secure manner. When you're emailing over a background check or a credit score like that, it's not a secure medium emailing that information. When you use a third-party service like RentPrep or one of our competitors, we have a lot of data compliance that we have to comply with. So every single year, TransUnion, who's our main data supplier, they will do an info security check on us, and we have to pass all of the items on their info security checklist. And these things include the way we handle the information, the way we store the information, what kind of security systems we have on our office, what kind of locks we have on the windows, like all sorts of information that we have to comply with. And when you're using a third-party screening company, what it's doing is limiting your liability because we have to make sure that we're not making those mistakes, and we're taking the onus off of you if you're going to be handling background checks. You don't want to handle background checks. You want to be viewing them through a secure portal where you can see them on our site. You don't need to be having a copy of the background check in your personal possession. So also, one of the nice things is when you deny a renter, it's called adverse action. If you're not familiar with that, but you issue an adverse action notice. Basically, what that is it just lets a interested renter know that you won't be renting to them. And when that happens, on the actual adverse action, and we have templates in our service that you can hand out, it will give the information of the third-party screening service. So if there's ever a time that they're going to be very upset, it's when you're denying people, right? So when you deny somebody, you're pretty much passing the buck and saying, hey, here's the reason why. The reason why is just due to information found in the background report or investigative report. And here is the name, number, and contact details of the Consumer Reporting Agency, a CRA, which is what RentPrep is. And we will take care of that situation. We will go over the report with them, see if there's any errors, see if there's anything that they maybe weren't aware of, and we deal with that angry, frustrated renter, interested renter that just got denied your rental property. So that's a great way to kind of, you're not really passing the buck. You're really just making sure that they're getting taken care of, but you're moving them on to the Consumer Reporting Agency instead of dealing with that tenant yourself, because you have, another tenant that you need to place into your rental property and get going so that you can get that unit rented. So that's a great point by Noel here. And he also talks about meeting the prospective tenants in person and many times at their current residence. That one's unusual, I will say, but I give him credit for saying that. I haven't heard that too much, that people will visit them at their current residence, but you'll certainly learn a lot about somebody if you can get in their current residence and see how they treat things. I know we've mentioned this before on the podcast, other quick tips too on that. If you can't see them at their current residence, like he's mentioning, walk them out to their car. How do they treat their car? I mean, that's what you really want to see, is how are they treating their environments. The way they treat their car and the way they treat their current residence is a really good indicator of how they're going to treat your property. So that concludes, well, you know what? Why don't I go back? One little mention here, though. He says that he relies less on the credit score and more on the personal touch and stable job. Stable job, I agree with 100%. It relies less on the credit score. This is really up to the landlord. Some landlords don't run credit. They just run the background check. They want to see the eviction history, criminal history, things of that nature, and they're less concerned with what the credit score is. And I agree, credit score can be misleading sometimes. Somebody mentioned it earlier. They said that, somebody can have a great credit score that just lost their job a month ago. So they haven't had time for unpaid bills to catch up with them. So you run their credit, it looks great. That's why making phone calls, that's why running the background check, doing those verifications, checking them out online, Googling their name, seeing what you can find. One situation that comes up once in a while in the office, because we run a lot of reports, we run thousands of reports every month, and every once in a while we'll get somebody who's upset because we didn't find an eviction. Well, if somebody is in court right now, going through the eviction process, our background check, everybody's background check, is not going to find that eviction. That's because it is not a filed eviction yet. They're in eviction court right now. Now, I know I get a lot of landlords and property managers who say that the current landlord will always lie to you, but it's not true, because I hear it all the time too, where people are like, here's another vote of confidence for calling the current landlord. I called the current landlord and they said they wouldn't wish this tenant on anybody. And this happens. Everybody's not out just to get rid of their problem. A lot of people will shoot straight with you. If they're already, almost to the last day of going through an eviction and they're ready to just rid themselves of this horrible tenant, a lot of landlords will just give you the heads up and be like, no, this person's awful. And then they'll vent and talk your ear off for probably 10 minutes because they're so frustrated. So that's why it's so important to even call the current landlord just to verify how this person was as a renter, because you never know, they might be in the middle of an eviction right now that's just not going to show up in a courtroom database yet because it hasn't been filed. But that doesn't mean that landlord can't tell you, you know what, this person's been a nightmare and here's why. So do your due diligence. Just even listening to this podcast, you took 30 minutes, maybe you learned a thing or two. Make sure you do your due diligence, because running a background check is not the only part of tenant screening. Just putting a rental listing up and then, doing an open house isn't enough either. It's an entire process. I'll link out to our tenant screening guide, which walks you down the entire process, but make sure that, you're keeping up to date in your local state laws. Join an association local, see if you can get some tips and information on that. And, keeping up on resources like this. You can find them online, and we'll link out to this Forbes article as well, so you guys can check that out. And thanks for listening. And hopefully we'll have Steve back on the podcast with me next week. We're going to be down in Florida for the next few days. We're going to be at the NARPM conference, so the National Association of Residential Property Managers, the Florida chapter. Looking forward to seeing some people and friends of the podcast and hanging out there for a few days, getting some way too warm sunshine in September. But thanks for listening, and until next week, we'll catch you then.